Hello, today we're going to talk about OneForm validations. I think this is the biggest thing on people's minds is how are validations built into OneForm? How does this even work? OneForm, in this case, look, I've passed no props to it, but I do have two fields. There is no submission of these fields at the moment. There's no way to submit these fields. There are a couple props related to validations. There's a validations prop. There is a validation type prop, and there is a group validation prop. Now, group validations, we're not going to go over those right now. That is more complex because it's when you have groups of fields and you need to validate on multiple fields. Here, we're going to validate on single fields. That's what this validations is for. And the reason this exists at all is to give you a very clean API to put in validations. Typically, you usually do one field validations. If you have group validations, they get more complex. And then a validation type, which would be something like, submit. You only validate on submit or you validate on change. There might be validate on blur and all this stuff, but right now, those are the only two that I'm thinking of adding because I want to be a little bit opinionated there. I think that'll be fine. And I'll explain why I want to be opinionated there when we get into fields being touched or not touched. And another word for that is dirty. If the field is, they're different words that people can use. None of them sound work safe, but it's fine. Validations takes an object. And in this case, we're doing change validation because we don't have a submission on this form. I'm going to validate it based on the change. This is still valid. Everything I'm writing here is completely valid for OneForm. You don't have to change it past the submission function. It's weird, but you don't have to. With validations, it's going to have the same format as something like values or errors. It's very similar, but it's a little bit different. Let's say we're validating the name. It's going to take an array, which you're like, what? It's going to take an array of objects. And still, what? And the objects are going to have an error message. Still, what? Why would you? No, error message. Got a little snake in me there. And then a validate function. And the validate function, it's like, still, what is going on? What goes in here? You can probably guess what goes in here. But the benefit here is that you can use any validation library that you want, and you can also create these objects and you can save them as utility objects. And they could be OneForm compatible utilities. So if you have an error message, you need to fill out a field or something, you can have that there. But if you want to be more custom about it, and you say you need to fill out the name field or you need to put your name in there, we could make that our error message. I'm going to drop it down a line because we don't have room. I'm going to make it so we have room by doing this though. Okay. You need to, it's just because it's so big. You need to add your name. Can we just a few more? We're very upset about it. We're very upset about it. I think 3 is probably enough. 3 is probably enough. Then there's this validate. And what does validate have in it? It has the value that you were validating. This is a little bit different than group validations. We'll get to that, but this is just to validate a single field. All you need is the current value. You don't need any other field values or anything. Just need this field value to validate. And what are we going to validate? We're going to make sure that length is greater than 0, meaning you have entered in a value. Pretty cool. I have not entered a value for name. Therefore, I will see this error message, right? Wrong. The field hasn't been touched yet. Therefore, it won't display an error message until I've actually clicked in the field and then clicked out, because that will trigger the fact that the field has been touched. And then now that it has been touched, now you can display error messages all you want. And because we're using change validation, the message will not go away unless we actually type something. If we do type something, this validate function will get run, and then it will check to see if my length is greater than 0 and if it is valid. When you call validate, this validates that this is true. If this is not true, then it is invalid, and it will display this error message that you gave it. The important thing about the fact that name is taking an array of objects is that you can have multiple of these. And name might actually be first and last name. You need a first and last name. Now, this is super simple logic, but we can check to see that value includes a space. And if it includes a space, that means you most likely typed the first and the last name. Obviously, that's completely wrong, but that's how the example form company, that's how they've determined how to do this. They're very unprofessional, if you can tell. Look at this. All caps and stuff on their error message. Geez, it's like they don't care about their users. If you see here, it will run. You're thinking like, oh, what's going to happen is when I click in and I click out, what's going to happen is it's going to error with this, and then I type in stuff, and then it's going to error with this. No, actually you can display all the error messages at the same time. It runs every single validation. The order does not matter. It will run all of them. And the order does matter in the terms of if you only want to display one error message at a time, you can determine which one is going to display by pulling off either the top or the bottom validation error message in your error message component when you build it. Because there's no standard way of making that, but there's a hook to get into error messages. We talked about in the last video. The point here is, though, that you can display an error message, this error message in particular, and you can determine which one you want to display, or you can display them all, or you could join them and put a space between them. There are lots of different options. You could put bulleted lists, whatever you want. So you have access to a bunch of error messages based on the validations that are run. Now, when you're getting error messages, you're just getting an array of strings tied to for that specific field. You'll get an array of strings for that particular field. It's very easy to process that data. You don't have to do anything crazy, because when you do your error, for instance, if you want to do an error, this is my example field error. It will take a name prop, and the name will be name, and that's how it can track the field errors for name. That's how you can do validations. There are 2 validations here for the name field, and both of them will be wrong. Now you're still thinking there's some opinion here, and I might change this. I might give more options that you can pass, not just validation type change, but it'll have more things that you can pass into it. Right now, they don't exist. For instance, if you want to, let me think for a second. The way it's going to work is that when you edit a field, it's not considered touched until you've actually clicked out of it or blurred the field, essentially. Once it is blurred, it is in the touch state, and it will be in the touch state forever. If you submit a form, all of the fields become in the touch state. Therefore, all validations will run. At any point in time that you submit it, all validations will run. Another thing about validations is that it only will validate fields that are registered. It will not validate unregistered fields. Now, we talked about this before a little bit, but if you had something like this where, his name, if somehow you're controlling the state of this field appearing or not appearing, that's not the responsibility of OneForm, at least not right now. The OneForm doesn't care about that. You care about if it has this field or not. It doesn't care about that. If you remove this field, it won't validate it because it unregisters. And if this becomes true, then this field will appear, then it will validate it. That's really clever. That's really cool, because the validations being there or not being there or having any effect or working on submission or anything like that is all built into OneForm. It just works. Now, sometimes it might not work the way the company that you're working for expects it to work. Maybe that's a problem. So some of the opinions I had were based on the fields and the forms for the company I was working for. I might add more options to change that. But right now, my plan is just to have change and submit. If you want to validate only on submit, it has the option. You can just type submit here, and it only validates on submit. But you can also do change, and change will validate on any field change and on submit. Once you're validating field changes, when you submit the form, the reason I say and on submit is because you always have to validate on submit. If you're going to pass in validations and you're going to submit a form with errors, that doesn't make any sense. The whole point of client-side validation is you stop submission. You don't let the API even get to it. You let the client do all the work to do the validation, and then your API can do its secondary validation after the fact before it puts it in the database. Or not puts it in the database, depending on your application. That's what's important here with the validations. And the change validation is also beneficial because this can hook into the onChange function, which we haven't talked about. And it doesn't do anything with it right now because I never even thought about this until just now. But there are ways to validate changes and make sure your form is in a valid state before you send it off. Cool. There's validation. Is that it? Really? This is the basics of validation? I can show you can put one here for email. So I'm going to add another validation for email, and it's going to have an error message. @ and then validate, and we'll just see. We could do a regex. I just don't want to do anything too crazy. I guess this would be the thing. But you could say it can have any value before, but it has to have something. And then it has to have something here, and then there needs to be a dot, and then it has to have something here, but the number of characters has to be 3, something like that. There's a very simple email validation. You could do .test, and it's not going to work yet because I haven't got value in. There. And you test value. Okay, there. There's your validation for email. You need an @. Actually, this isn't even the @. This is needs to be an email. They're not even going to exclamation point that. You should know better. And you could, I don't know how you even make this 2 or 3. Like I have no clue how to regex that piece. In this case, they don't expect that you have a .co or whatever. If you do, they don't let you. It's too bad. This company didn't think through that. Obviously, get good validations when you use them. If you want to use what was it? Yup. I don't know. Some validation library, you just put the function here and just process that on the value. In fact, you might just be able to be like, I don't know what it's called. Okay, I can't remember if it's, I think it's yum. But you yum like email validate. I don't know, but it's something like this. You would call it here, and as long as it takes a value, you could do that. Otherwise, you'd have to wrap it. But the important thing about all of these validations here is that each segment or each piece of this could be pulled out and put into utility that you can share with your whole company so that you can use it anywhere you need to. And that would be really nice. And you could even share the whole array if you really wanted to. And then you could add to the array by concatenating onto it. You're not stuck with the only the validations, that were there. You can add whatever you want. What I would do is probably export each of these separately and then allow people to add them individually as needed. Because sometimes this is awful. Who wants that? There you go.